Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Jonathan Borgwing, CEO and founder of Vig, and Chris Salvo, co-founder and CEO of Electrified University and Electrified Garage. Jonathan, if you could please share your screen, the webinar is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, Murphy's Law pending. Hopefully everyone can see my screen at this point. Very excited about discussing the topic today. Very much appreciate my co-presenter here, Chris, for coming on board with us to go through this journey. I love the fact that we were going to be able to see your questions in real time. So please make sure to leverage those outcomes so that we can keep this as interactive as possible. That being said, my name is Jonathan Borgwing. I am the founder and CEO of Vig. Incredibly proud of the team that we have over at Vig. We do end-to-end solutions, and we started the company in about 2021, looking to solve educational innovation challenges. And virtual reality has been one of those that we've been really passionate to solve at scale for many of our clients. And Chris, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yep. So my name is Chris Salvo. I am founder and CEO of Electrified Garage and Electrified University. My background is I was a BMW mechanic that moved over to Tesla for about 5 years. As I'm sure everybody's seen in the news, Tesla isn't known for having awesome service. So I felt that I could do it better. So I started a garage in the back of my dad's house, like so many other great companies that start in a garage. And now I have 2 locations, and I've found that the bottleneck is we need to be able to train people properly. So that's how I came to know Jonathan, and Jonathan has presented us an awesome solution for how do we train the next generation of technicians to be able to do the things that we do.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So a little bit about Vig. We're going to be specifically talking about Vig XR, our product line dealing with virtual reality. We do offer end-to-end solutions, everything from e-learning solutions to learning management system hosting. But specifically here, we are focusing on our Vig XR solutions. One of the biggest things that we have had the opportunity to leverage is our Agile ADDIE framework, which is a peer-reviewed instructional design model that actually focuses on the implementation of core agile principles into that ADDIE model itself. We actually went through an entire research process with an IRB and found we actually cut 60 to 8 days off of a courseware that we were doing. So we actually applied this framework to everything that we do at Vig, allowing us to really get some great return on investment for our clients. It's that hyperfixation on return on investment that really led us to CenarioVR as a solution for virtual reality. And that's a very general overview of sort of some of what Vig does. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about Electrified Garage? Oh, you're muted, Chris.
Sorry, I was loud in the background here. So Electrified Garage started as just being a third-party alternative for Tesla service. But then we've kind of branched out to all EVs, literally everything from little kids' Power Wheels that will take a cordless drill battery and make it faster that way, to electric yard equipment, to hybrid cars and full electrics. If you have HBO Max at home, if you want to check out Downey's Dream Cars, you can see me on the right-hand side of that picture on the screen. We actually converted 2 vehicles from gasoline to electric for Robert Downey Jr. And so that's a pretty cool thing to check out. So we do conversions as well. And that's kind of the new age of hot rodding, if you will, for present vehicles today. We've got about 24 years of cumulative experience working on Tesla with the people that work with me. Our YouTube subscribers are pretty significant. If you see Rich, the guy with the black cowboy hat, he's got about 1.5 million followers on YouTube. And then obviously we have very high Google reviews, or like 4.9 to 5. So
awesome. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's been an absolute dream working with Electrified Garage. And as we looked at some of the industry challenges coming into that market share, if you will, one of the things is how do we train the coming solutions for technicians? And sort of we looked at Vig's focus on educational innovation and Electrified Garage's expertise and clear market leadership in that. And we really came together and co-founded something called Electrified University. And really where this is, I think, most significant to this audience here is how do we train electrified technicians in these tasks? It's with an incredibly diverse workforce, all spread out throughout the United States, that has very specific target audience needs. The need for interactivity, the specificity for hands-on, but one of the biggest things is the expensiveness of the equipment surrounding that. And so as we looked at building this trade school and how we can leverage it with economies of scale, as well as ensuring that the right educational modalities were attached to this at the right time for the right learner, that's really where we sort of started envisioning a comprehensive training curriculum around how we're training these technicians. And we really looked at it as there were several costs associated with that, or several challenges with that training. It's last on this list, but it was first in our mind, was safety. Handling these vehicles. I mean, Chris, what's the voltage that goes through some of these cars?
They're anywhere from 400 up to 1,000 volts. So pretty significant, way more than what you would, traditionally have an outlet in a house. It's more in line with what's in the power lines above your head. So obviously very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, so safety is a huge piece of that puzzle, and being able to practice, and especially as our learners getting hands-on experience with this it's a huge risk. It's something that we have to look at and deal with in those environments. The other piece here was the cost associated with something like like how do you work on a vehicle, right? How do you show that? How do you build that environment in which somebody can practice and make mistakes? And cost is a huge factor. I mean, if you can essentially, when you think about a phone, if you do something wrong with a phone, you break the phone, it's a $600, $700,000, and now they're getting to what $2,000 almost. But if you brick your phone, that's one thing. But if you brick a car, that's an entirely, I mean, how much does a battery pack go for now, Chris?
They're anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000.
Yeah, so
significant oopsie.
yeah. And so that was one of the biggest things we looked at, was like, how do you, because we want our students to be able to make mistakes in an environment that allows them to do these things. The other piece was scalability. If we look at how cost impacts scalability for that, it's another challenge as we look at expansion and distribution of that curriculum and content. And then finally, again, that piece of interactivity, which is really the crux of all the other challenges that align themselves with that. As we do a task analysis, we look at learning objectives, we look at the requirements for each of those of the curriculum itself. E-learning can only get us so far in some of these things. We need to go and we need to train. In the Army, when I was in the Army, we used to say train as you fight, right? We want to get to that realistic environment as much as possible so that we can make sure that we're engaging our learners and making sure that when they do start to work on cars, that it is resemblance of a real environment. And so we really landed on virtual reality as an opportunity to bring that to the forefront. The immersiveness of virtual reality allows for an increase in learner comprehension. There are lots of studies out there that have shown how virtual reality increases engagement as well as learning outcomes through those because of the attention span that's there. We also, given the economies of scale and given the materials that we're talking about, it's a much more cost-effective option for our learners, but most importantly, it's safer. As we look at, touching, you touched the wrong wire. I might be oversimplifying it, Chris, but there are a lot of voltage exchanges going on with those. So you want to talk about a little bit about how easy it is to trip that voltage in those vehicles?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest concern is more so that the amount of amps that it takes to kill a person is less than 300 milliamps, which is hardly enough to power an LED light bulb. The stuff that you're going to be playing with inside of a battery, you could literally weld two pieces of metal together with. So if you're not conscious of what you're doing, you can either, you can have electrocution, you can have burns, you can cause fires. It's very much like, what is it, the game of Operation, where you don't want to touch the sides. It's the same idea, but there are real consequences to doing so. So by doing it this way, it's a lot easier to get that muscle memory, to understand, okay, I check from here to here, here to here, go down the list. And then if you accidentally touch something you're not supposed to, it's okay. But once you get to the real world, it's not forgiving, and you only get one chance at things.
I think Kristen said it very, very nicely in the chat. Mistakes we make in virtual reality are mistakes not made in reality. Absolutely. Yeah. That safe practice is so important. The other piece that we really looked at was scalability. We wanted to make sure that if we had a large set of learner audiences, that we weren't defined by the amount of vehicles we had for them to work on. And so by leveraging virtual reality solutions, we could actually have individuals practicing prior to getting access to high cost, low student throughput devices, increasing the overall return on investment for both our learners as well as the actual schooling and curriculum itself. I like to balance that. When we think about funding, we talk about the financing involved and the actual KPI, business KPIs. I like to talk about that in terms of return on investment, but I like to talk about return on effort for our learners who are dedicating that time to spending that experience. And we see that in a scalable environment, making sure that they do have that return on effort that they're putting forth is very important to us. And virtual reality pays that off in dividends for them, giving them the ability to make a psychologically safe mistake in that environment without being necessarily seen to do these things, as well as having those metrics on the output for instructor intervention where needed. So one of the things we did was, once we said, okay, we know we need to do virtual reality, we know that's going to be a critical component, we started looking at virtual reality tools. And we see a lot of challenges with some of the tools that are out there. I think the number one challenge was the development. A lot of it requires specific Unity development, for example. And as soon as we have instructional designers working in Unity, or we have to bring on Unity developers to build things out, costs skyrocket, and return on investment typically starts to wean out, if you will. It becomes very, very difficult to receive that. And when we also looked at some of these non-traditional learning VR authoring tools, there's typically no XAPI or SCORM compliance. In fact, XAPI and SCORM compliance are very rare. They have some plugins in Unity, but even those don't always work as desired. The other issue was there was no web access. And so we essentially, when building in some of these other authoring tools, when you built virtual reality, you'd have to build an e-learning component to it, because not all learners are going to be able to have access to a headset, depending on your distribution strategy, as well as not all learners are going to want to put on a headset, potentially based on a variety of different pieces, or there may be something precluding them from doing so. We also had a challenge with device compatibility. So if you have a rather small program, then standardizing around a singular device is sometimes easier. But as we looked at developing across a wide variety of solutions for our learners, device compatibility became a real question of, if we purchase this device and we are able to build it along this solution, is it going to work on all of the other tools that we bring to bear, especially with the high rate of innovation that's currently occurring in the virtual reality market. And that ties directly to the distribution model. Every headset has a different app store. Every headset has a different distribution model. Some of them allow you to go into the actual hardware and put that on. And so it becomes very complex, and that increases cost as well as the operational requirements for learners to get access, and adds barriers to entry. And then finally, we see a lot of per seat pieces for VR authoring tools as far as students throughput. And so that was something that it's not a deal breaker for us, but it added a expense as we continue to be successful with those programs. And it's something that we definitely looked at during that process. And so when trying to determine between which VR authoring tools we're going to leverage, CenarioVR really stood out to us. The ability to, I think the number one ability for us as we looked at how we could leverage CenarioVR with Electrified University was the ability to interact with both the computer as well as the VR headset. The distribution strategy was incredibly important for us because we were able to create the same experience, but also we didn't have to worry about necessarily uploading to specific app stores. Great part is if we needed to have things downloaded directly to devices, CenarioVR has an app on stores in order for them to download that as well. So that sort of answered our device compatibility challenges as well as being able to have scalable solutions for them. Those two pieces made the return on investment statement much more understanding as well as the return on effort for our learners. And that's really where, as we build through a learner-centric environment, that exchange and that less frictional approach where we were able to give options made a huge delineation on sort of how we wanted to progress. And then the ability to host the VR experiences directly into learning management systems with XAPI and SCORM compliance was huge. That was absolutely huge for us. So that we didn't need to teach a whole new system. We didn't need to add different levels of support. Rather, we were able to have individuals go through the learning experience that they have in the past and are able to react accordingly. And the beauty is, if you have a headset on, and we're going to show this in a moment, but if you have a headset on and you decide that, and you want to visit your learning management system and log in, and you experience one of the VR solutions, it's just a button at the bottom right-hand side that you click in order to gain access to that solution. So, I mean, its ability to make the experience for learners easy to use was critical for us. And so what we wanted to do was sort of show our first take with CenarioVR, as well as the first view of our interactions with this solution. This is actually the first project that Chris and I ever worked on. And we chose this specifically for two reasons. One, to show what a novice person can do with CenarioVR, but also to highlight some of the lessons learned that we discovered while we went through this process. So Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about what the procedure is that we're going to be leveraging here?
Sure. So everybody has power windows in their car at this point in time. The mechanism that allows the window to go up and down inside of the door is a fairly common failure item for Tesla. And so this how-to or this VR segment is going to be about how do you go into the door of the car, remove that component, install a new one, and then reassemble the door.
Awesome. So pending Murphy's Law here, I'm hoping everyone can see a play button in their screen. I'm going to hit play, and then I'm going to move quickly into the menu item. It may be a little bit loud, and that's why I'm going to sort of move on. But as we built this, this is the first thing that learners would see as they experience this was a sort of an introductory video of sort of what they're about to go through, and a little bit, it's almost like a hype video, if you will. Please remember that this is the primary audience is a virtual headset, so they'd be able to look around inside this environment. Because we're on a computer, we get the exact same experience, but I'm moving around with my mouse. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and I may jump just so that I can hear. And so you can see here the movement is seamless as I work around that environment. I went ahead and jumped forward. But so initially everyone thinks this is a picture until somebody walks across the screen right there. As you can see, this is actually Chris's garage up in Ocala, Florida. It was the first project we ever worked on. And so one of the things we said, okay, well, we need to create a menu so that people can work through, sort of pick what solutions they necessarily want, which is really nice. And so this is we use this as sort of a orientation portion so that what we often find is that they'll look around the area to sort of acclimate themselves, and sort of see sort of, what is where, if you will. And we even made it so that you could pick these up and move them around, so that as we are orientating new learners to that environment, they get an understanding of sort of what they're going through. I'm going to go ahead and start the VR showcase. So we chose this task specifically because the most difficult thing to do in virtual reality is task-based training. If we think about sort of how you go about doing this and what the modality is, this is really picking up and learning how to do something we figured was stretching the limits. And so as we look around here, we can actually see our guest over here in the white shirt. And you want to talk a little bit about sort of what we're seeing here, Chris?
So that is probably the most fun you'll ever have in a Tesla, because we put a gasoline V8 engine in it. So we took the engine out of a Corvette, basically, put a supercharger on it. It still has a manual transmission, and it was originally a flood car, so all the batteries and drive units and stuff were all junk, and the body was fine. And we were kind of debating what makes the most sense. And so a junkyard offered us components in exchange for some publicity on the YouTube channel. And then we spent the next 2 years and about $250,000 converting that car to gasoline. So it's kind of the big middle finger to Elon, but he hasn't reached out and threatened us in any way, shape, or form, thankfully. So yeah, it's a pretty fun car.
Yeah, everyone always looks sideways when they hear the stuff coming out of it, the sounds.
Right.
And what's interesting is we actually showed this demonstration at the Orlando International Auto Show. I get that right, Chris?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. And we actually had all sorts of people put on the headset and actually go through this. And what was tremendous to see is how quick people could learn how to do this procedure. And we actually saw like little kids completely go through and replace the Windows regulator on vehicles just based on the experiential learning that they were going through. So one of the things we did is, as we thought about this, we said, okay, so we have a task board set up. And the reason we have this task board is our goal here is to have people understand the process in which they go through to replace the Windows regulator. And in order to do that, we created a listing of tasks that they have to do. But the other thing we did was, well, what if you get stuck inside of a virtual reality environment? You don't want to take off your headset or go look at other resources to try to find answers. So we were actually able to, CenarioVR has this great ability to embed videos inside of these environments. And so when you hit play, everything pauses around you, and you'll actually see the amazing people at Electrify Garage walk through and talk to you. I'm going to pause it, go step by step through that specific task. And that was really, really great to see, because if people got stuck, we could see them, reviewing the links. And what's even cooler is through XAPI statements, we can actually see what steps people get stuck on the most, where they're clicking. And we can even do after action results, like sending emails to learners about the things that they had trouble with based on those XAPI statements. Really, really cool stuff. One of the other things I just wanted to touch on is the importance of the way that CenarioVR is handling virtual reality. So we looked at there's a lot of pictures that you can do around it, but having video brings the world to life around the learner and really makes that change for that immersive feel for people. Having this environment that they are able to immerse themselves in, using a 360 camera to record that environment, was a game changer for us, because as we look at the cost to build virtual reality outcomes, it drastically reduces the cost. We're using I think it's a $600 or a $1,000 camera, but you can do lower fidelity options. But it sets the stage and it gives realism. And a lot of times when we look at virtual reality, having that ultra realistic environment helps with that immersion. The other thing that we did and we really like about this is we're actually able to bring in assets that we can use a LiDAR scanner on the back of our phone into this environment. And so we don't need to worry about too much about data modeling or sorry, not data modeling, modeling 3D graphics or finding things that already exist. But we can also bring in those things that do exist where it makes sense. So here is the actual drill from Chris's shop. We started this about a year and a half ago, I want to say. So the cameras on the back of our iPhones have gotten much better, and we're actually able to record much higher fidelity drills, for example. And so we were able to take these renderings and LiDAR scans and actually bring them directly into CenarioVR to make them interactive. And the other thing that we noticed was a sort of a best practice was making sure that you'll see that there's a little yellow glow and it's rotating. And that's to make sure that people know that they can interact with that piece of the puzzle. Because everything looks so interactive and so realistic, sometimes having that call to action is very helpful. So one of the other things that we noticed is when you're inside of the environment and you load in, this is the view that you see that I have pictured here right now. One of the things we learned was in order for people to see what they're looking at, they have to move around and look around the room. And so as we were explaining the demonstration to people, we realized that that's one of the lessons learned is moving those things readily accessible. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this up, this drill. In a VR simulation, you'll be able to use your triggers on your headset if it's a Quest 2 or a Pico or what have you. So you can pick it up with a mouse and just drop it onto that hotspot. Did you hear the drill sound in the background? Okay, so they may not be getting audio. So what happens is once I drop that onto that hotspot, there's a drill sound that plays because there's all a bunch of triggers inside of CenarioVR that you can have, identify interactions that are taking place. And so with this, we also realized as we're done with the video and we're done with everything else, I'm putting everything together, that having the dropping of where we want to put parts was too close to the camera. And so you'll see where we pick this up and we'll drop it in here. And this is the next step, if you will. We found that was a lesson learned that we adjusted moving forward, where it's more visible for individuals. But if you notice, I picked those things up and I dropped them in there. And so CenarioVR has tremendous ability to have hotspots and drop areas that allow us to actually calculate scores and calculate values based on what is dropped in there. So now if I look up, I'll actually see that I've moved and gone through 2 of these items based on the things that I'm doing. And I did want to bring my attention to this right here, the disconnection of the door. This is an asset that we did not scan ourselves, but that we were able to bring in to CenarioVR, as well as the actual tool display itself. And those are 3D images that we were able to actually to bring in and work with it. So the CenarioVR is incredibly compatible with existing VR assets. So I just went ahead and removed the door. And this is actually something that we scanned with Chris and his device. So they were actually pulling this apart as we were doing it so we could scan each step of the process in detail. And then we'll see here, I can drop my panel here. And now we're transitioning to another scene within there for learners. And we can see that the door is here. We can see the change in the environment, as well as we still have some of the old, the other things that were happening. And so if I was, okay, how do I do the next thing? I can hit the play button here. Things will load for us and we can hear expert advice. So as we think about leveraging our environment around us in order to immerse our students, if you will, we typically do about a 30-minute to a 1-minute looping of video to give that surrounding area. And then from there, we'll go ahead and go to the next area in which a action will impact that learner's immersive experience, if you will. So here, removing the door panel was a large enough shift in the environment that we wanted to transition them to another 360 video session. Chris, can you talk a little bit about how you felt this process went as sort of the initial thing as like sort of the client and sort of going through this process with us and the videotaping?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have had zero experience with virtual reality prior to this. I've done a fair amount of TV and that type of thing. So some of it goes hand in hand where you're trying to tell a story and you need to, block off different segments as you're making progress through the project as you're doing it. Um, I had no idea that your cell phone could literally do LiDAR scanning, so that was really cool. I've actually used that a lot since then, just in my own projects. But overall, it was very simple to do. My technicians thought it was amazing. One of my guys has been in the industry for over 20 years, and he was like, "I wish we had this when I was, a teenager, and learning how to do this, and how much easier it would have been." And the likelihood for either breaking things or kind of blindly muddling through something would be much less. So I would say the overall experience was very positive. It was not difficult to do. And the end results, even the old timers, quote unquote, found it interesting and thought that it was a cool way to learn.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris.
Yep.
Yeah, so and really as we put this together, so some of the other things that we learned is really making sure that you have a plan before you walk in. When we did this initial shot in this initial sequence, I think Chris, you and I said we decided that day what the procedure is that we were going to shoot.
Yeah. Yeah. There was not really a whole lot of before thought or forethought as to what we were doing or how we were going to do it, or again, because I didn't really know the technology, I wasn't sure what was going to present well or not. This is kind of so we probably should add a camera a little closer in on what we're doing, because a lot of it is intricacies inside the door. But yeah, it was a good learning experience.
Absolutely. And some of the things that we did to adjust this is we actually have, what was the procedure that we were doing next, Chris? Was it the motor?
Oh, the drive unit. We were disassembling a drive unit, which is basically the
Absolutely.
equivalent of a motor in a regular car. Or
So
actually,
what,
it's the motor and the transmission together.
and that was a much more, I think it was much more complex procedure, at least it felt that way from
Very
my
much so.
standpoint. Yeah. But because we had the lessons learned from last time, we were actually much more methodical with the way that we were going about both recording the videos for expert advice, as well as laying out the steps that were going to occur for that. So much so that we were actually able to create what we call workshops inside of CenarioVR, where they're able to go in and play with the materials and sort of go by the step-by-step area, and then try it without that sequential like the sequential task board we have up here. And so they can test their knowledge on how well they're doing different things for that procedure. So I'm going to go ahead and transition over here. So some of the lessons learned that we had, I think I talked a little bit about this, is for those who are going to start doing this today, it's incredibly important that you have a shot list with what assets you're going to use or need. So when you go on location, Chris is about an hour away from me. So when we go up there, I want to make sure I'm prepared, but I also want to make sure I capture everything, because essentially Chris is standing down a very busy operation to do these things with me. And we want to make sure that we take advantage of recording, for example, the right tools, the right drill, for example, and all of these things add to that immersive environment, because there are specific tools that, one, they're not readily available assets outside of the store, but also we want to make sure that we're presenting that sense of realism for our learners. The other piece is doing a storyboard ahead of time. Some people that are very experienced with e-learning love to use storyboards. Understanding that the storyboard in VR, it works a little bit differently, where you want to make sure you have the assets, the interactions, and how it sequentially flows between one another, as well as when to capture that 360 environment and how that changes. And these are things that are great to learn, but everything from camera setup. So if you place the camera in one place, you don't want that necessarily jumping around unless that's your intention. and so on and so forth in that capacity. The other piece there is making sure that you're using VR at the right time, at the right place for the right learner. VR is a tool, eLearning Brothers or ELB Learning has a tremendous amount of tool sets in there. But if you're doing an e-learning product, then not necessarily everything should be in VR, like reading a document necessarily, unless there's some of that interactivity. But having a high value interaction with virtual reality will actually help other times that you implement that within that organization and within that environment for them. And so we have found that ensuring that there's a high value interaction, we have found learners really, really enjoy the VR solutions at that point. And then also, as you're building this, there are some options that as you're designing it and you're thinking through that user experience and that learning experience, just remembering that not everyone is going to interact with it inside of a headset. Some of them may be a keyboard user or a web user, and vice versa to that. So there are some really, really cool things like the ability you can actually set up an entire floating interface. And in a web-based environment, that becomes a very easy thing to measure. But when you're in a virtual headset environment, you just don't want to make sure it's within the view table of what they're looking at. And if you make it static and you move your head around, it'll always be down here. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to interact with sometimes. So it's just that those user experience outcomes are really, really great. And we highly encourage rapid prototyping as you go through and you build these and testing it out. And the feedback loop with CenarioVR in order to get things uploaded to the web and try them out is very fast, which is great for your development. So with that, I wanted to pause and open the floor to any questions for Chris and I.
All right, gentlemen, right now we have one from Selena. She asks, have you dealt with any accessibility issues? If yes, what did you do to help the learners?
Great question. So I want to follow up that question with a question. Are we talking, well, actually, I'll answer both sides of this, if you will. If we're talking about like 508 compliance, we have not had to deal with that specifically quite yet. There will be, you'll have to work with your 508 compliance office if you have one, if you're talking about like a larger organization, based on the application and based on the learners to see sort of how they would like to deal with that internally. Typically, because it's also accessible on the computer, you're able to sort of handle that as well. But we haven't ran into any issues quite yet with that. Now, as far as accessibility, like people being able to access it outside and wherever they're at, which I'm not sure which of those I think it was the first one probably that you were alluding to. But as far as being able to access it, we haven't had any issues. In fact, that's been one of the driving factors on how we love to utilize this, because it's all accessible from the web. We don't need to go through distribution stores. If you have a headset and you can go to a website, then you can access these experiences, which is a huge driver.
All right, question number 2 from Dan. Do learners play all the way through at once or stagger learning times modules to complete?
That's a really great question. So I would, as you build these experiences, I would build it in 15-minute expectation chunks, because you don't know what's going to happen. They're going to be in an environment. I mean, I have both the Meta Quest 2 as well as the Apple Vision Pro, and I'll rock those on for quite a long time. But different people will have different, it might weigh on their head and on their neck a little bit. So typically about 15 minutes of that experience. The great part about this is they do have the ability to send results back to the LMS to identify where somebody left off at, which is really great. So they can always pick up wherever they go, but then also you can segment it within your menu systems or even within the learning management systems themselves. You can copy and paste the work that you have done, so you can almost set up a template. So it's very easy to go from one to the next.
And that segues into the next question. What type of metrics do you track with this type of training?
Oh, this is that's a great question as well. So with XAPI, Chris and I have tracked all sorts of things like what play buttons are being hit the most, for example, to identify where learners need more feedback. There are question and answer solutions built into this, so you can actually track question success rates. But what's really cool is we could actually, and we haven't done this for Electrified Garage yet, but you can actually build into CenarioVR we had a client who needed an e-commerce store in there. So we built in an e-commerce store where if they clicked on the product, it would then send them an email based on what they had, like based on what they had selected. So it was really cool. You can really track almost anything. We have your traditional, we had another client who we did a dialogue conversation with. So we could actually track the flow of conversation and where people were choosing to have those in order to reduce some of like the wrong answers or potentially the wrong answers, how they handle some of those situations. So yeah, there's a lot of really great data-rich environments you can do, because essentially you're doing a simulation of that environment, and there's all sorts of data that you can necessarily pull from those. So hopefully I answered that question.
You did. Now, assuming you have new revisions, changes, and updates to your training, let's say a model number changed or a drill type changed or what have you, do you end up making updates to it, or do you launch a whole brand new version another time?
So it depends. Obviously, it depends on the impact to learner. It depends on our development rate. It depends on the impact to the learning objectives. But to be able to update these environments is very easy. So if like a drill changes, that's essentially just replacing one asset. I mean, you have to replace it in as many scenes as those assets come up, but it is not a huge burden to adjust. As our portfolio increases, it will, but the nice part about that is Chris is very standardized in his approach and sort of the garage's approach on what they do. And so, Chris, what would you say like the rate of change with toolage is within the garage?
I mean, even if it does change, it's usually not like it's just the new model of it. It doesn't necessarily change the way in which it functions. So for the most part, that stuff can stay static. It would be more a case of like if we changed our technique in which to do something, that then yeah, we probably would just have to do a full redo of whatever it may be. But for the most part, it's taking a wheel off a car is pretty much the same no matter what car it is. Yeah. So I mean, I guess it kind of depends, but for the most part, things don't change that dramatically, unless the technology of the car changes, and at that point, it's probably time for a whole new one rather than trying to revamp an existing one.
Got
And
it.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But what's really cool about this is because of the way that vehicles work, these will not become obsolete, because the process in which adjusting sort of like a 20 to 23 Tesla Model 3 is going to stay. I'm going to say this, and Chris, you're going to have to correct me because I'm definitely not the car guy, the two of us, but the process and the technique is going to stay the same unless we're introducing new toolage or new, yeah.
Yeah, new vehicle or model.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's very easy to update things. Now, with that Windows regulator, yes, we are already in the process of adjusting it based on some of the lessons learned that we had. But the best way to do this is to go out there and just start trying it and doing it. Start taking a 360 camera and record it somewhere so you can see the change of perception of what it looks like when it starts wrapped around in 360. Everything's going to seem potentially closer to you. And so that was a huge lesson learned that we had, or the differentiation between on the web and in the headset. Now, the experiences aren't drastically different thanks to the magic of CenarioVR, but there are some experiential differences just by virtue of the modality.
I would also say that, you need to be mindful when using a 360 camera that there are no secrets, there's nothing to hide. So, you know, in some cases, the shop wasn't as clean as I would have liked it to be on camera for certain instances, or, you know, there were things around the shop that shouldn't be there. So you need to be very mindful of the environment you're in and make sure that everything is presentable, because inherently people aren't going to always just pay attention to whatever you want them to pay attention to. They're going to probably get lost or have ADD for a minute and wander around the room and take a look at the other stuff that's there. You know, the same way people go looking for stuff on Google Maps today and try to find Easter eggs and that kind of thing. So
Being OSHA approved with everything that you're showing everyone is quite important.
Yep, absolutely.
And Chris, this next question is specifically for you. How has VR improved the training for your techs?
So really the biggest one has been like in terms of the high voltage stuff we talked about earlier. So where it's potentially a dangerous environment, the PPE around it is expensive. Some of it has a shelf life, so it has to be rotated out. So not having to necessarily put out a whole bunch of money just to do training, and do it virtually inside of that environment. And then they can make mistakes if they want to. They can accidentally, you know, touch two things together that they're not supposed to, but also understand the process of how to do things from start to finish. And, you know, the same as when, you know, I don't know, I might be dating myself, but when you played Mario for the first time, you learned, okay, I need to go in this order of sequence to get to the end of the level. It's basically the same idea. You know, by the fourth or fifth time that they do it, they've got it down pretty well. And, you know, by being able to measure their level of engagement, where they're clicking, what they're doing, you can ensure that they're not just clicking through to the end and trying to get, you know, just get the certificate. So, anything that's dangerous to do has been the most beneficial. The other stuff has made it easier where you can only see so much doing like a webinar like this. Whereas if I film something here, I have more than one location, I can send that to the other location, and those guys can essentially do the same thing that we're doing here. And they have again, it's more interactive. They can actually get involved with what's going on. And it makes it easier where I have one skill set in one location, a different skill set in a different location, and now I can kind of even the playing field between the two.
You were speaking earlier of different generations within the garage. How has the older generation reacted to using something like VR?
So for the most part, they kind of get sick when they put the headset on. One of them has gotten used to it, but for the most part, they still prefer the traditional kind of walking around like what Jonathan's shown you here, which is fine. It really doesn't matter either way. You know, the younger generation is definitely more used to doing that kind of stuff, but because we can present it in both forms, it makes it a lot easier to, you know, you're not leaving anybody out of the room, so to speak.
Understood. And it looks like that's about it for our questions in the Q&A panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. And so I just wanted to leave our contact information. Please feel free to get a hold of me if you want to talk CenarioVR 3D or how we're leveraging it in VR. And then we're going to have a lot of fun announcements here coming soon with the Electrified University. Very, very excited about that coming up. We are also incredibly excited to say that we will be at DevLearn, participating at DevLearn as guests with ELB Learning. So very, very excited about that.
We're excited about that as well. In fact, I'm going to steal your screen for just a little bit to be able to put up. Here we go. There we are. So we're calling it the Summer of Learning. And if you would like an opportunity to win an all expenses paid trip to DevLearn, yes, that includes your airfare, must be in the US, or at least be able to get to the US first. That's all I ask. And also your hotel, of credit card for food, the entry to DevLearn all that great stuff, and a couple of VIP passes to our fantastic VIP party. Let's just say it's going to be 80s themed and there's going to be an amazing band, but I'll leave that alone. If you schedule and attend a 30-minute product demo of your choice, doesn't have to be CenarioVR, but of course, that's what we were talking about today, before September 2nd, you will automatically be entered to win that all expenses paid trip to DevLearn, and possibly, you never know, meet Jonathan, meet Chris, come hang out with us and have a good time. And on that note, I think it's time to say thanks so much to everyone for showing up today. We appreciate you. Thank you so much to Jonathan and also to Chris for being here. You're doing some amazing things with our product, and we appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having us. It was great to virtually meet or speak to all of you, and hopefully this has kind of opened your mind to other alternatives of how to train people in the workforce.